I realized my wife's ring was gone, while she was still lying motionless in the hospital bed. Her finger was swollen and red, empty. No signs of a struggle, no raised voices, just a cold, hollow space where the North Star had always been. The nurse said only one family member had come in to visit, my son. I stood there frozen, understanding a bitter paradox, while I was praying for my wife to wake up. My own flesh and blood had quietly taken the one thing she treasured most. Before I go on, please tap subscribe and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Your presence helps quiet stories like this keep being told. And now, let me return to that moment, sitting alone by the hospital bed, staring at my wife's empty hand. I didn't ask the nurse another question, not because I trusted them, but because the answer was already right in front of me. The hospital room was just as tidy as when I had stepped out. The machines kept their steady, cold rhythm. Elara lay there, her breathing thin, her eyes closed, like she was taking a short afternoon nap after a long day. If I hadn't looked at her hand, I could have convinced myself nothing had happened. I pulled a chair up beside the bed. Elara's hand felt so light that I was afraid if I held it any tighter it might disappear. Her ring finger still carried a faint red mark, where the ring had rested for 40 years. The mark hadn't faded yet. It felt like a quiet reminder that what was taken wasn't a diamond, but the final line between family and betrayal. That ring was never meant to be shown off. I bought it the year we reached 40 years together. No big party, no wine, no congratulations. Just two aging people sitting in a small kitchen in Maine where the ocean wind slipped through the door every night. I placed the ring in her hand and told her I was never good with pretty words. But I wanted her to have something with her even for the day I might not have the strength to hold her hand anymore. Elara smiled. She always smiled that way, soft and brief, like she didn't want to trouble anyone. I remember the first time she wore that ring, not because it sparkled, but because of how she looked at it, like she was looking at a promise kept. Now, that promise had been taken away in silence. I sat there for a long time, long enough for the sky outside to fade from gray to black. The lights in the room turned on automatically, white and distant, making Elara seem even farther away. I spoke to her quietly, words that didn't need answers. I told her the snow was coming early this year, that the stray cat outside the house still hadn't left, that I would stay. I didn't mention the ring. I'm not sure why. Maybe I was afraid that saying it out loud would make everything real. When I stepped into the hallway, my phone vibrated softly in my pocket. A message appeared. No name, just an automated preview. I'm dealing with something urgent. Don't call Dad. I read it once, then again, then a third time. Not because I didn't understand, but because I needed to be sure I hadn't read it wrong. I remembered Logan's voice when he was little. Every time he made a mistake, he would lower his head and mumble an apology. He once cried just for breaking a plate. I believed a child like that would never grow into someone who could take what belonged to another. I leaned back against the cold hospital wall. It felt like a door had closed inside my chest. Not sharp pain, but a heavy pressure spreading slowly and deep. I began putting the pieces together. Logan asked to visit his mom right after I stepped out. 15 minutes. No one else entered the room. No reports, no disturbances. And the ring was gone. There was nothing more to say. I didn't call him back. I knew if I did, I would ask questions I wasn't ready to hear the answers to. I returned to the room and sat down, staring at Elara's empty hand. For the first time in my life, I felt powerless in front of my own family. Not because I couldn't act, but because I had never imagined I would have to. That night I didn't go home. I slept on the hard chair beside her bed. Every time I woke up, my eyes went straight to her hand, as if the ring might return on its own if I watched long enough. But every time there was only the empty space, and the faint mark fading hour by hour. The next morning, I went to the front desk and asked for the visitation log from the night before. My voice was calm, like I was asking about the weather. The clerk checked the screen and answered exactly as I expected. Only one family member had visited during that time. My son. I nodded, said thank you, and walked away. No scene, no argument. I understood that any reaction right now would be pointless. What I needed wasn't an apology, but the truth. And the truth rarely comes to those in a hurry. On my way back to the room, I stopped by the window overlooking the parking lot. The snow was falling thicker now, covering every trace, and a realization settled in, colder than the winter wind. Logan didn't just take the ring. He chose to take it while his mother couldn't speak, and while I still believed family was the safest place in the world. I returned to Alara's side, took her hand without the ring, and whispered a new promise. This one wasn't for memories. It was for the truth that was about to come into the light. I didn't tell Alara about my decision to leave Maine for a few days. She was still lying there silent, as if the world outside no longer mattered. I just rested my hand on hers, long enough for the familiar warmth to sink in. Then I stood up. Some things, if you don't do them right away, you never will. I didn't need to ask where Logan was. 3 days later, the answer appeared on my phone, through publicly posted photos. White snow, firelight, wine, expensive clothes, a resort in Aspen, a place people go to forget that somewhere else hospital rooms never turn their lights off. I studied every photo, not out of envy, but to make sure I wasn't mistaken. Logan was there, smiling. Sloane stood beside him, her hand on her husband's shoulder, like everything had been neatly taken care of. I turned off the phone and sat still for a while. There was no burst of anger like I had imagined, just a dry, hollow calm. I understood then. This trip wasn't random. It had been paid for with something that didn't belong to them. Aspen greeted me with a sharp, cutting cold. I arrived in the late afternoon when the resort lights were coming on. Everything looked too clean, too smooth, as if it had been designed to hide the things no one wanted to talk about. I walked into the lobby. My old shoes left small, wet marks on the polished stone floor. No one noticed. I didn't need them to. I spotted Logan and Sloane near the bar. They were sitting by the window, snow-covered mountains behind them, clear glasses in front of them. Logan was saying something. Sloane laughed softly, tilting her head. The sight made me stop for a few seconds, not because I hesitated, but because I needed to remember this moment. A moment after which I would never see them the same way again. I walked over. Logan saw me first. The smile on his face disappeared almost instantly. Sloane turned her eyes, scanning me from head to toe, then stopping at my old heavy coat. She didn't stand up. "What are you doing here, Dad?" Logan asked. His voice was low, like he didn't want anyone else to hear. "Looking for you," I said. Nothing more. No one invited me to sit. I pulled out a chair and sat down anyway. The air between us grew heavy, even as laughter and soft music filled the room. I looked straight at Logan, then at Sloane. I didn't mention the hospital. I didn't mention the ring. I let the silence do its work. Sloane broke it first. She leaned toward me, her voice steady, not a trace of discomfort. "She's in a coma, Dad. She can't feel anything. The ring was just lying there, not being used. And we needed it to keep our business standing. Without it, everything would collapse." I looked at her, searching for even a hint of hesitation. There was none. Every word came out like a calculation. Logan didn't object. He just stared into his glass, his hand tightening around it. I nodded slowly, as if I were considering her words. Then I asked a question that made both of them look up. "Are you sure the buyer didn't inspect that ring carefully?" Logan looked at me, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. Sloane frowned slightly. I went on, my voice calm and even. I said that ring wasn't like other pieces, that I had taken out a separate insurance policy for it, that inside there was a very small identification mark, something an untrained eye would miss, and that if it was sold without proper documentation, then this wouldn't just be a family matter anymore. No one spoke for several seconds. I saw sweat form on Logan's forehead, even though the room was cold. Sloane set her glass down. The sound of glass against the table seemed louder than it should have been. "Are you threatening us?" she asked. "I'm just telling the truth," I replied. The truth always follows things taken in silence. Logan turned to Sloane and whispered something. I couldn't hear it, but I could see panic beginning to creep in. I stood up and adjusted my coat. I didn't need to say anything else. What I came for was already done. They understood now. This trip was no longer as safe as they had thought. As I turned to leave, I heard Logan call after me. "Dad." I stopped, but I didn't turn around. I knew that from this moment on, everything had shifted. This was no longer a quiet loss, but a series of choices. And I was ready to walk that road to the end, even if it meant closing doors I once believed would stay open forever. I left Aspen that same night, not because I was afraid to stay, but because I knew I didn't need to anymore. The seed of worry had already been planted. Greed would take care of the rest for me. On the ride out of the resort, my phone was strangely quiet. I didn't check social media. I didn't look for more photos. I had seen enough. One thought kept circling in my mind. When people take what doesn't belong to them to build a life, that very life becomes the trap. 2 days later, Logan called me, not hesitant like before. This time his voice was rushed, breaking apart mid-sentence. He said the man who bought the ring wasn't a regular shop owner. He was an antique dealer who worked in cash. When Logan mentioned the identification mark and the insurance, the man didn't panic. He just said calmly that if trouble came, every trail would lead straight back to the seller. I didn't answer right away. I let Logan talk. I listened to every pause, every sharp breath he tried to hide. For the first time in years, I heard the voice of a frightened child in my son again. But this time, I felt no pity. "We need your help, Dad," Logan said, almost begging. "Help how?" I asked. On the other end, Sloane spoke. Her voice was still controlled, but there was a crack in it now. She said if I withdrew the theft report, everything would stop. And if I could provide another 20,000, they would buy a different ring, similar enough to mislead the buyer. I stayed silent, not because I was shocked, but because I wanted them to keep talking. Every word they spoke pushed them deeper into a trap they still couldn't see. "What did you just say?" I asked slowly. "You took the ring from your mother's hand, sold it, and now you want me to use money to cover it up." No one denied it. Their silence was the clearest answer. I agreed to meet, not because I wanted to save them, but because I needed the truth, spoken in full, with no way out. We met in a rented room, far from the resort. Logan walked unsteadily. Sloane kept her appearance neat, but her eyes no longer met mine. I sat down and placed my phone on the table face down. I told them I needed to hear everything, from beginning to end. Not to judge, but to understand what I was standing in front of. They began talking. At first, carefully. Then the words spilled out. They told me how Logan removed the ring, about the buyer, the cash, the trip. No tears, just reasons, arranged like excuses. I nodded, asking short questions now and then. Every answer was recorded, not in my memory, but in the device quietly running on the table. I didn't force them. They spoke because they believed I was on their side. When the story ended, I picked up my phone and looked at them. I said I would think about it, that I needed time. Logan let out a breath of relief. Sloane gave a small nod as if a deal had been sealed. Then I stood up. I said I couldn't withdraw what had already been documented, that what they had just admitted was no longer a family matter, and that from this moment on, I would not stand between them and the consequences. Logan jumped to his feet, calling my name. Sloane lost her composure, her voice rising, rushing, but I was already walking out. The door closed behind me. Soft and final. On the way back to Maine, I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel victory. Only a long, dragging exhaustion. I thought of Alara, of her empty hand, of how the ring had become a bargaining tool in a trade she never agreed to. When I returned to the hospital, nothing had changed. Alara lay there silent. I held her hand and told her that I had done what needed to be done. No details, just a promise, kept in a different way. That evening, my phone vibrated once more. A short message from Logan. No request for help, just a question. "Are you really going to close every path for us?" I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I turned the phone off. Some paths were never closed by me. They were broken the moment the ring left the hand of someone who couldn't protect herself. And I understood then. What came next was no longer in my hands, but in the light of the truth, when it finally stood exposed before everyone. I didn't reply to that message. Not because I had nothing left to say, but because at this point, every word would have been unnecessary. Once the truth is spoken, it doesn't need debate. It just needs a place to be heard. I went back to the hospital the next morning. Alara still hadn't woken up, but her color looked steadier. I sat beside her bed and read a few lines from the local news, an old habit of mine. I didn't mention Logan. I knew that hearing his name right now would be too much for her fragile heart. I had to keep a quiet space for her, at least until everything was over. I planned the gathering simply. Not a party, just a small prayer meeting at the house. I invited a few relatives, a few old friends who had known Alara since the early years. No one questioned it. In times like these, a gathering feels natural. Logan and Sloane arrived late. When they stepped inside, the room fell silent for a brief moment. Logan avoided everyone's eyes. Sloane kept her calm appearance, but I noticed her hands tightening again and again around her bag. I nodded to them, as if none of our previous conversations had ever happened. We sat in a circle. I said a few short words about Alara, about asking everyone to give her a moment of quiet prayer. My voice was steady. I could feel Logan watching me, waiting for a sign, but I didn't look back. When it was time to play a short memory video, I stood up. I said that before we prayed, I wanted everyone to hear something. Not to accuse, but so no one would have to live in confusion anymore. I turned on the device. No images, only sound. Logan's voice came first, clear, undeniable. Then Sloane's, words about the ring, about taking it from their mother's hand, about cash, about the trip. The room sank into silence. No one interrupted. No one even breathed loudly. I didn't look at Logan. I looked at Alara's photo on the wall. She was smiling, gentle as always. I wondered what she would think if she heard these words. Maybe she would stay quiet. Alara always chose silence when she was disappointed. When the recording ended, I turned the device off. No explanations, no commentary. I didn't need to say who was right or wrong. The truth had already stood up on its own. Logan jumped to his feet, saying something in a broken voice. Sloane tried to speak over him, but her words carried no weight anymore. A relative stood up and asked them to leave. No shouting, just a cold, firm request. They left the house in silence. No one walked them out. No one stopped them. The door closed behind them, not loudly, but final. I sat down feeling like I had just closed a chapter I never wanted to open in the first place. 2 days later, I received a call from the local police. They said the buyer had cooperated, not out of conscience, but out of fear of being pulled in deeper. The ring was returned, no handoff. It was placed in a small pouch and left at my front gate just before dawn. I found it when I went outside to get the newspaper. The ring lay there quietly, as if it had never left. I picked it up, feeling its familiar weight again. But when I brought it to the hospital and tried to place it back on Alara's hand, I realized something that made me stop. Her finger no longer fit it. The after effects had left her hand thinner, stiffer. The ring couldn't return to its old place. I set it in her palm and gently closed her fingers around it. I didn't say a word. There was no need. Some things once taken and returned are never whole again. That evening, I sat alone in the quiet house. I thought about Logan, not with anger, but with emptiness. I understood that, from this moment on, our relationship had changed forever. Not because I revealed the truth, but because that truth had existed long before. Outside, the winter wind moved through the bare trees. I held the ring in my hand and realized it was no longer a symbol of memory. It had become a marker reminding me that some boundaries, if you don't guard them yourself, will be broken, even by the ones you once trusted the most. Alara woke up on a quiet morning when the winter sunlight slanted softly through the hospital curtains. I was sitting there reading when I heard a faint sound. Not a call, just a change in her breathing. I looked up and saw her eyes open slowly, as if she had traveled a long way just to return. I took her hand. It was still thin, but warm. Alara looked at me for a long moment, her eyes not yet sure where she was. Then she asked softly but clearly, "Is Logan doing okay?" The question stopped me. Not because I didn't have an answer, but because I understood her heart still placed her son above everything else. I didn't tell her the truth. I said Logan was fine, that he was busy with work, that everything would be okay. Alara closed her eyes like a weight had been lifted. I knew then. Some truths aren't meant to be hidden, only delayed until the one hearing them is strong enough to bear them. In the days that followed, Alara recovered slowly but steadily. I stayed by her side and brought her home once the doctors allowed it. The small house in Maine breathed again. I hired the best nurses I could afford. No show, no favors asked. I wanted Alara cared for properly, in the quiet she deserved. The ring stayed in the drawer. I didn't mention it. One afternoon, when Alara was strong enough to sit up and look out the window, I opened the drawer and placed the ring on the table. She looked at it, didn't touch it. Then she smiled, tired but gentle. "No need," she said. "My hand is different now." I nodded. We didn't say anything more. We both understood. Some keepsakes don't need to be worn to keep their meaning. Not long after, I decided to sell the ring. Not in haste, not out of bitterness. I chose a quiet way. The money was enough to cover Alara's long-term care, and what remained I donated to a local fund supporting the elderly. I didn't put my name on it. I wanted the ring, instead of being a cause of breaking, to become something useful. I didn't contact Logan. I didn't block him either. I simply closed the financial support I had been carrying for him. No announcement, no dramatic cutoff, just stopping. I believe that when someone becomes an adult, they need to learn how to stand on their own feet, even if that lesson comes late. I heard later that Logan and Sloane had to leave the life they once showed off. No more luxury trips, no more expensive parties. They worked at a small shop, slowly paying off the debts left behind by the trip that broke everything. I wasn't happy to hear it. I wasn't sad either. It just felt like the natural result of the choices they had made. One evening, Alara asked me if I had any regrets. I asked her, "Regrets about what?" She said about letting things go so far. I thought for a moment, then told her that if there was one thing I wished I had done earlier, it was setting clearer boundaries. Not to punish, but to protect the most fragile things. We sat together, listening to the ocean wind move through the trees in front of the house. There weren't many words, but the silence wasn't heavy. It felt like a normal evening. Two people who had lived through enough loss to understand the value of still being able to sit beside each other. I don't know what the future holds. Alara still needs time. Logan will have to find his own path. As for me, I learned something late but necessary. Love doesn't mean giving without limits. Sometimes love is knowing when to stop, so no one is broken again. When I turned off the light and sat beside Alara, I thought about the ring that was no longer there. And I understood this clearly. The most valuable thing we managed to keep wasn't a diamond or money. It was the final piece inside this house. And for me, that is enough. If you've stayed with me until the end of this story, thank you for being here and listening. If it made you reflect, please like, subscribe, and share so real stories like this can reach more people. The message I want to leave you is simple. Material things may help us go far, but only character helps us stand firm. Family is not a place to exploit, and love does not mean accepting every wrong. Knowing how to set boundaries at the right time doesn't mean losing your family. Sometimes it's the last way to protect dignity and keep peace.